With this staff, you shall do my wonders.
So I'm up here this morning, and I have something to confess to you all this morning. It's not something I'm proud of, and it has been weighing on me pretty heavily these last few weeks. This is something that's hard for me to admit, but I fear I have to tear down the facade that I've been living behind for so long and get this out in the open. All right. Okay. Here it goes. I, Dave Chernacki, stand before you here this morning as a man who has never seen the Prince of Egypt. I know, right? I know. Bet you weren't expecting something such utterly shocking of a revelation this morning here. Start off church. I mean, how could I have let this happen, right? How could I have lived the past 20 years as a Christian and not seen the Prince of Egypt? Heck, how could I have lived the past 8 years as a father and not seen the Prince of Egypt? I mean, the good Lord above knows I've seen every other animated film in existence over the duration of Kalen's relatively short life. Even all those weird knockoff movies that end up on Netflix that you're like, oh, this kind of looks like Finding Nemo, but it is very much not Finding Nemo. In the past, when we've shown clips at church, I've enjoyed the clips I've seen of Prince of Egypt, and I've enjoyed all the clips we've been watching this summer as we've been going through Exodus. So I guess I've seen a good chunk of the film now, just not necessarily in chronological order or all together. And I've been struck by how beautiful some of the animation is, their use of shadows, and the storytelling I think is really, really beautiful. But I've just never taken the time to see the movie. And please believe me when I say that I didn't mean for this to happen. It just kind of did. And I hope you don't look at me too differently now going forward as we move on today. I was sharing this secret shame of mine last week with Andrew because we were talking about the service this morning he's producing. And he said, well, you know, Dave, you do have a week to remedy this. And he's right. I could have remedied the situation, watched The Prince of Egypt this week, and you would have been none the wiser. But where would that have left me? Without an introduction to this message, that's where that would have left me. But in actuality, I have a pretty good reason for not having watched The Prince of Egypt this week. The other 1,100 weeks since the release of Prince of Egypt, I don't necessarily have as good of an excuse, but this past week, I have a pretty good excuse. This has been a pretty long week. I'm one of 4 customer service representatives at work, and this past week, 2 of them were off on vacation. This left me and the head CSR to split their workload between the 2 of us. And you know, that's in addition to all my normal work that it keeps me busy throughout the week. It wasn't bad necessarily, it was just really tiring having all that extra work. I had to go out of my way to ask a bunch of questions about accounts that I'm not familiar with and make sure I had all the right information to get the jobs going. And I had all this extra work and all these extra jobs to follow around the shop and make sure we're on time and getting done the way they should be. And I also put enormous pressure on myself this week to not let that work pile up on my desk so it would not feel insurmountable or like it was going to crash down and swallow me up. Each day I left work exhausted and unsure how I could manage and muster the energy to go to the gym, to spend time, quality time with my family, and or work on this message. So watching The Prince of Egypt this week wasn't too high on my priority list. Also, maybe extend a little grace my way if my delivery is a little rough this morning. I've been really tired and, it's been a week. Each day leaving work, I felt the tiniest bit of sense of freedom. Freedom from the craziness, and I found myself wishing that this would be the end of the crazy week. That all this extra work would be done with and gone by the time I got to work the next morning. But of course, that wasn't the case. Despite how much I wished to the contrary, each morning my coworkers were still on vacation and there was still a new pile of work on my desk. And that work needed to be done. Have you ever found yourself feeling this way about work or life in general? Maybe you felt the relief of finishing a massive group project for a class only to starkly realize you still had half the semester to go. Maybe you once thought that once you decided to follow Jesus, that was the hard part and it was now over, but you're finding new challenges living in salvation. The Israelites surely thought that once they gained their freedom from the Egyptians, all their pain and troubles would be gone forever. But is that how that played out? What does feeling this way say about the Israelites, and what does it say about us when we feel this way? What can God teach us about ourselves and our lives in these moments as we read through Exodus this summer? We, of course, are continuing that summer series on Exodus this morning, and we have reached arguably the most famous part of the story, both culturally and biblically. But before we get into it, I want to do a quick recap of what's been happening. So, on God's command, Moses has been trying to get the Pharaoh to free the Israelites. Whenever Moses asks, the Pharaoh is all like, nah, I'm good. So, God decides to send some plagues to get his point across. For 9 plagues, the Pharaoh holds his ground. I mean, you can say what you want about Pharaoh, but he's consistent. But then God decides to send a 10th and final plague. We heard a great message last Sunday from our guest speaker, Sarah Knob, about this 10th plague, which killed the firstborn Egyptians, but passed over the firstborn Israelites. And this was finally enough for the Pharaoh to agree to let the Israelites go free. So yay, right? Pack your bags, grab your things, put the promised land into Google Maps and be on your way, right? Well, yes and no. Apparently the calculating quickest route feature was still a few thousand years from being developed. When Pharaoh start in Exodus 13. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God let them in a roundabout way and through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. The Israelites left Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night, and the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. Then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses. Order the Israelites to turn back and camp at Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. Camp there along the shore across Baal-Zephon. Then Pharaoh will think, the Israelites are confused. They are trapped in the wilderness. And once again, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after you. I have planned this in order to display my glory through Pharaoh and his army. After this, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites camped there as they were told. I imagine this must not have made much sense to the Israelites. After 400 years of slavery, surely God would guide them swiftly out of Egypt. Scripture tells us that God has a plan and he gives that plan to Moses. But we don't know necessarily how much of that plan Moses shared with the Israelites, or how easily that information could have even been shared with that many people. Did the Israelites trust Moses to know that where he was leading them? There must have been some chaos to leading that many people out of Egypt, and at least some confusion among them as to where exactly they were headed and how they were going to get there. Yet God does provide the pillar of cloud and the pillar of flame, and he is miraculously guiding them through this roundabout way. And we can feel, as the Israelites probably did, that even when we are perfectly following God, it feels like we are walking in circles. But that may be just exactly where he wants us to be. But God asks us to trust him. He is asking Moses to trust him. And Moses is asking the Israelites for their trust. To trust that God's ways are greater than their ways. And I'm sure that we'd all agree that that is not that easy to do sometimes, especially when the end of our story is not that clear. I'm sure many of the Israelites did not like not knowing what was going to happen, and they were frustrated about getting out of Egypt not as fast as they possibly could. And some of them were probably thinking, we better get out of here before the Pharaoh changes his mind. And that was a thing that was wise for them to think, because that's exactly what happens. When word reached the king of Egypt that the Israelites had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds. What have we done letting all those Israelite slaves get away? They asked. So Pharaoh harnessed his chariot and called up his troops. He took with him 600 of Egypt's best chariots, along with the rest of the chariots of Egypt, each with its commander. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so he chased after the people of Israel, who had left with fists raised in defiance. The Egyptians chased after them with all the forces in Pharaoh's armies, all his horses and chariots, his charioteers, and his troops. The Egyptians caught up with the people of Israel as they were camped beside the shore of Pihahiroth, across from Baal-Zephon. I was going to butcher all of those names this morning. When the Israelites see that Pharaoh is there, they see him and his army approach. They are rightfully fearful and panicked. As the Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw that the Egyptians were overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord and they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this was happening when we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It is better for us to be slaves in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness." I would really love to say that I don't relate with the Israelites here, but that wouldn't be telling you the truth. I get why they panic. I get why they are fearful. They thought that they were on their way out of the hands of the Pharaoh just to have him show up angrier and more vengeful. Would love to say I would have been on Moses' side, not doubting God, but I don't often feel that strong in times of crisis. The situation turned so quickly that I imagine the Israelites feel their hopes and dreams of this new life immediately dashed. I tried to think of what a modern equivalent of this situation could be. What kind of situation could change so drastically and so quickly? What could instill this kind of quick panic and fear in a large group of people? Fair warning, things are going to get a little bit heavy here for a few minutes. But the thing that immediately came to mind is if I were to suddenly find myself, or we were to suddenly find ourselves in an active shooter situation. It's a sad and unfortunate reality of the times that we live in, that this is something we have to at least be a little prepared for. Now, the odds of being in a situation with an active shooter are still statistically pretty low, but they still happen enough that it's a possibility. Could happen at work, at school, while you're out to eat, while you're out shopping at the mall. Your perfectly normal day could turn on a dime to panic, uncertainty, and fear for your life. Now, it does no good to live in fear of something like this happening or playing out these scenarios over and over and over in your head all the time, and I don't do that. But when I see the horrific stories and the horrific nature of shootings, I do sometimes wonder, How would I react if I was in that situation, if that was me there? I know I'd panic. I know I'd be fearful for my life. I know a million thoughts would start running through my head about all the things I might not get to do in my life, about not being able to see my daughter grow up, about not getting to hold my wife again. I know this is a dark and kind of heady comparison to think about, but I often find it easy to divorce myself from the people in the Bible, the stories that we read, and not truly think about the fact that they were people, that they lived, and that they had natural responses as human beings, just like we do. As much as I would not want to react like the Israelites did in this situation, I get how that's a true, natural human response of fear and uncertainty. On the flip side a little bit, when I see reports about or after a crisis, whether it be a shooting, a devastating storm, or any number of things, I'm always fascinated by the stories of the people who are the calm in the midst of the chaos. Those helping focus the people around them, helping them get to safety, encouraging them, loving them in that moment, and being peace for them. It takes a real strength and courage to be that type of person in those moments. And Moses is exactly that for the Israelites when Pharaoh and his army arrive. But Moses told the people, do not be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. Just stay calm. The Lord himself will fight for you. What powerful words from Moses. What an amazing response from God in the response to the Israelites' faithlessness and rebellion. God tells these doubting, fearful Israelites to be silent and watch the salvation God himself will work for them. All they must do is be silent and watch. God will do it all. They must sit there and watch, and Moses must act. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will charge in after the Israelites. My great glory will be displayed through Pharaoh and his troops, his chariots and his charioteers. When my glory is displayed through them, all Egypt will see my glory and know that I am the Lord. Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on each side. Through Moses, God splits the sea open for a path for the Israelites to walk through safely on dry ground. Like we saw earlier in that clip from that movie I have not seen, the sea became like walls of water on either side of the path God created for them safely to cross. I see a shot like that. I think that's beautiful. I'm like, why haven't I watched this movie? I imagine there must have been a lot of mixed emotions of the Israelites as they passed through the Red Sea. One, there's the fear of them being caught by the Egyptian army. Two, there's the amazement of what God was miraculously doing for them right there in that moment. There was fear that these walls of water could come crashing down on them at any moment. And then there was the want and the desire to push through and get to that other side of the sea as quickly as possible. Despite physics, despite the laws of nature, despite all likelihood and against all odds, they make it safely to the other side. God has kept his promise to free and protect his people. When the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers. So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. Through one act, God saved Israel, defeated the enemy, gained glory for himself, and showed that there was no one like him. God says that through this event, he will get glory over Pharaoh. He was going to show that there was no power like his power and no authority like his authority. And beyond that, God is going to use this one cataclysmic event that people would remember for centuries. He would use it to be the story that told the whole world that there is no God like Israel's God. And it changed the Israelites' hearts. Almost as quickly as they turn from doubt when they see Pharaoh and his army approaching, they turn back to God when they see this miracle he performs. When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. This is great and beautiful and powerful. What exactly does it mean for us today? What does it mean for us as we're trying to follow Jesus the best that we can? The Exodus is not only a historical and biblical event, but a grand metaphorical picture of all of God's adopted children walking out of salvation into the world by faith, enduring the highs and lows of life until we reach the place that God has prepared for us. Life is hard. Life is challenging. At times, it can seem like we're walking through the Red Sea with these walls of life on either side of us, threatening to crash down or swallow us up at any moment, much like I felt like the work on my desk this week. It can often be hard to see that other shore from where we are right now. We can doubt, we can fear, because we don't have the benefit of seeing the whole picture like God does. God saved Israel despite their doubt and faithlessness. In the same way, Jesus saves us in spite of our moments of doubt, selfishness, unbelief, and sin. Like God did for Israel, Jesus does it all for us. We just get the privilege of knowing Jesus' whole story to look back on, and we can see God fighting for us and winning the battle over death. I am thankful, and it is good that Jesus saves those that struggle with doubt and faithlessness at times, because we all go through it from time to time. It reminds me of one of my all-time favorite song lyrics: blessings not just for the ones who kneel, luckily. But that also doesn't mean that we can keep doing as we please, or we can rest easy in doubt. It means that God's grace is so much more powerful than we could ever imagine, that he looks past those things and invites us into a relationship with him still, a relationship of redemption and freedom with him. The miracle of the crossing of the Red Sea to freedom did not permanently change the Israelites the way you might think it did, witnessing such a miraculous event. Yes, they put their faith in God and Moses, as the scripture tells us, but the story does not end there. God still has work to do on them, and they struggle many times with their faith after that. In the same way, if we stop here, then the story is that we don't have to do anything once we've made the decision to follow Jesus. But the reality is, once we take that first step, God is still very much in the process of refining, redeeming, and sanctifying us. Salvation is both an event in our lives and a lifelong journey. Often we're able to look back on our lives and we can see the things God has done for us and things God has done to work on our lives and our souls. But I find, at least for me, I don't know about you, we don't often recognize those moments in the moment that we're in. And I think there are a few things we can do that can not only battle against the fear, the doubt, and the times of faithlessness like the Israelites experienced, but also we can use these things to focus our minds and our hearts on God and how he is working in and around us in our everyday lives. The first thing we can do is see Jesus in God's deliverance of the Israelites. The parting and closing of the Red Sea is a grand and beautiful picture of what Jesus did on the cross for us. In one act, Jesus saved us and defeated the enemies of sin and death. With one act, using one instrument, God saved his people and punished sin like he did at the Red Sea. In Jesus' death on the cross, we see the closing waves of the sea consume our Savior like Egypt. And in the same moment, it opens up a gracious path for us to freedom and salvation. This is also some of the imagery we're supposed to see in our own baptism. We go under the water and die like Egypt, leaving our sin and its punishment buried there, only to come up like Israel on the other side, free from our oppressors and ready to live. Through the parting of the Red Sea, God saved Israel, defeated the enemy, gained glory for himself, and showed that there was no one like him. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus proved that there is no power like his power and no authority like his authority. Second thing we can do is we can train our minds and hearts to look for the miraculous good that God is doing in and around our lives. God faithfully performed miraculous works to save his people from the oppressions of the Egyptians. He parted a body of water to be as dry as dirt. It's easy to read that passage and read the scripture and think that miracles like this don't happen anymore. But it just isn't true. God is everywhere and he is always working. We may never see him part a sea in front of our own eyes, but he is doing miraculous things around us and is not just limited to the stories in the Bible. So what about us? What are the things that God has done in our lives to make us believe in him, to trust him, and to see his power and his glory? We can train our minds and our hearts not to focus on the bad things or what didn't pan out or what didn't happen like we had hoped. But we can train our eyes and our minds and our hearts to look for and celebrate all the good that God has done and is currently doing around us. If we start looking for these things intentionally, it will help us get in tune with God's frequency and give us the tools to combat the restlessness and doubt when things get tough and we're faced with the challenges of life. Just like when the Israelites put their faith in God after seeing him save them from the Egyptians, we too will find it easier and easier to put our faith in him when we are constantly noticing the work he is doing around us. So at the end of the section that I had for this morning in Exodus, in chapter 15, it tells us that after they had reached the other side of the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites sang a song of deliverance to God. I'm not going to read that passage here right now. It's pretty long. It would take a little while. But I love that they did that, and I think what they did is very important. They took time to sing and praise God for all that he has done for them. We sing songs of worship every Sunday here at our worship gathering. We also take time to reflect on the message and we hear and respond to how God might be working in our hearts each Sunday morning. This morning, I want to do things a little bit differently, and I want to take an opportunity to do that in a way together. Just as Israel sang their song of victory, I would love for us to sing a song reminding us of Jesus' victory over sin and death. Together, let's sing that as a community, that we have so much to be thankful for God. Don't worry, there'll still be a full worship set later, and there'll still be time either during worship or after you take communion that you can fill out the responses on the back of your card. But for right now, won't you please stand with me, and we can join together with the history of the Israelites and those that have come before us from thousands of years ago in singing a song in praise of all that God has delivered us from.
God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time. With no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of life. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. vapor of your breath the planets form. And if the stars were made to worship so alive, I can see your heart in everything you made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. And if creation sings your praises, so will I. God of your promise, you don't speak in vain, no syllable empty your voice. For once you have spoken, all nature and science follow the sound of your voice. When as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. And if it all reveals your nature so alive, I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of your grace. And if creation still obeys you, so will I. So will I. So will I. If the stars are made to worship, so will I. If the mountains bow in reverence, so will I. And if the oceans roar your greatness, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. And if the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. If the sum of all our praises still falls shy, then we'll sing again 100 billion God of salvation, chase down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. And if you left the grave behind you, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you've done. Every part designed in a work of art called love. If you gladly chose surrender, so will I. like you would again 100 billion times. But what measure could amount to your desire? You're the